This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I am here in a green room in Toronto with none other than John Szabo, Master Sommelier. How are you today, John?
Marvellous, Jamie. Thank you.
Fantastic. We haven't seen you for quite some time, but today we've been here in Toronto with Wines of New Zealand speaking about New Zealand Pinot Noir. Now, I would like to know from you, when was your very first experience of tasting New Zealand Pinot Noir?
Very first experience. I believe that would have been back sometime in the 90s when I tasted a wine from Central Otago, which at the time was completely unknown. New Zealand was not terribly well known, but if it was for Sauvignon Blanc. But I tasted this wine from a company called Shard Farm. I don't even know if they still exist.
Shard Farm, right, okay. And how was that first experience of New Zealand Pinot Noir for you?
A revelation. You know, I didn't have a whole lot of experience with Pinot Noir from anywhere at that time, but I remember this wine being pretty deeply colored and quite ripe and round and soft and silky as Pinot Noir can be, especially from Central Otago. So, it kind of set me off on a journey to discover more.
I think that was Melissa popping in the door there.
Yes, organizer.
From Wines of New Zealand Winegrowers. Now, you've been in the business for some 3 decades now. How have you seen the evolution of New Zealand Pinot Noir?
I think it's changed completely from almost non-existent. You know, we can talk about the first Pinot vines planted, depending on who you ask, maybe in the early 70s in Nelson, but really the story picks up at the beginning of the 80s in Martinborough, or more technically Wairarapa,
yes.
So region in the North Island, southern end of the North Island, where a group of producers like Adarangi, for example, a well-known name, or Martinborough Vineyards, started planting some of the first Pinot vines and making some really exciting wines, and from there it's kind of picked up. Central Otago story really starts at the end of the 80s, but more seriously end of 90s, early 2000s, when there was a rush to plant Pinot Noir all over, and now we've seen since then a real consolidation of vineyards, a recognition of where the best sites are, a real maturity, a real evolution in winemaking style, and a move, as we see in so many other parts of the world, towards a little bit more, we'll call it transparency, a little bit less winemaker and a little bit more place that's showing through in the wines.
You mentioned in your seminar the importance of clonal selection within the Pinot Noir of New Zealand. Perhaps you'd like to speak to that once more.
Yeah, well, I don't want to get too boring. I mean, talking about clones is never terribly exciting.
I get incredibly excited about it, John.
But in the case of Pinot Noir, yes, it matters a hell of a lot. I mean, Pinot Noir is very, very mutable, and different clones give completely different results. But in New Zealand, the story is quite interesting because the material, as I pointed out in the seminar, that was available back in the 80s, let's say, when Marlborough was being planted out, was really Pinot Noir meant for sparkling wine. And there's still some great sparkling wine made throughout New Zealand from Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and other varieties, but not really great table wine potential. So things got a lot more exciting when the so-called Dijon clones from France were brought in, earlier ripening, capable of producing, you know, pretty rich and voluptuous styles of Pinot Noir. But I think the most interesting clone, if we have to go there, is we'll call it a heritage clone, and it's called the Abel clone. And there's a great little backstory. I'll give you the brief version of this. But yes. This was a sort of suitcase cutting that was stuffed in the boot of a returning rugby player who. All the girls are coming in. So this rugby player returns to Auckland Airport. He's got these cuttings stuck in his boot there, discovered by the customs agent, whose name happened to be Malcolm Abel, so they were confiscated, of course. But Malcolm was a grape grower in Auckland, and he recognized the importance, potentially, of this material, which was, according to legend, brought from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti in Burgundy.
But according to all these stories, all of these suitcase clones come from DRC, no?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, you know, they must have posted guards at some point because people from all over the world were coming to.
But none of the vineyard left.
take cuttings. And one of the production is so low, all the vines are cut up. So anyhow, this clone was taken by the customs agent and put through quarantine and planted in his own vineyard. And then there was a guy named Clive Payton who worked a vintage with Malcolm and took some of these cuttings, with permission of course, and planted them in his vineyard, which is Aderangi, so still one of the great Pinot Noir names in New Zealand. And from Aderangi, and it's still called sometimes the Aderangi clone, this material was moved throughout the island and is the basis for some of the island's best wines.
You mentioned the original clones being used predominantly for sparkling wine. That would be referred to as the Swiss clone, right?
Yeah, there were a couple of Swiss clones, but essentially a sparkling wine material.
So what is exciting you most in New Zealand regarding Pinot Noir these days?
I would say that we're at the point where we can dig a little bit more into the regionality. I mean, today's seminar was all about going from top to bottom, from Hawke's Bay down to Central Otago, passing through the major regions and looking at some of the differences. You know, we're looking at differences in soil and climate, of course, and then the cultural history that grew up around these different areas, and now reflected with this more transparent view of winemaking into the glass. So we can talk now, you know, about the savouriness of Martinborough or North Canterbury, Waipara versions of Pinot Noir, or the slightly rounder, softer style that you would get out of Nelson or even parts of Otago, and the bright red fruits of Marlborough Pinot Noir. But even within Marlborough, you know, the three main regions, get a little deeper flavor profile from the clays of the Southern Valley versus the more perfumed and finesse and more fine-grained tannins of the river gravels from the Wairau. So, you know, these are things that get Pinot Noir drinkers excited, and I'm certainly keen to follow the evolution of New Zealand Pinot Noir. I think we're pretty far down the line, but we're certainly nowhere near the end of it. Much more to discover and more fine-tuning to be done.
Superb. In closing, you mentioned how much you adore certain New Zealand Chardonnay, and you mentioned Aterangi. I wanted to mention that one of my favourite Chardonnays in all of New Zealand is Aterangi Chardonnay. I was curious as to your thoughts on theirs. There are two, actually. There's a more recent bottling called the Masters, which has come out, which I've not had the chance to taste. But their previous single vineyard one, I believe, before that, was possibly my favourite New Zealand Chardonnay.
Yeah, well, I mean, today was all about Pinot Noir, but we could easily slide Chardonnay into the discussion. You know, we don't have to talk about clones as much, but we can certainly talk about regional difference. And, you know, frankly, if you look at the greater world of wine, Chardonnay grows everywhere, but there aren't that many corners of the planet that can produce the sort of wines that excite you and me. And New Zealand is certainly up there. And yeah, Helen Masters is the winemaker at Aderangi. She makes absolutely cracking stuff. But then again, so does Blair Walter down in Felton Road and all throughout Martinborough, although the production is quite small. There's some terrific Chardonnay. So if you're a Chardonnay fan, a lover, New Zealand is ripe for discovery.
Superb. John, always a pleasure to catch up with you. We'll speak with you again very soon, I hope.
Cheers. Thanks for having me on.
Bye for now.